The year is 1941. Over the gray, choppy waters of the English Channel, Oberleutnant Klaus Richter feels like a god. His Messerschmitt Bf 109 is an extension of his own body, a perfect predator of steel and fire. Below him, a small convoy of British merchant ships crawls towards the coast, looking like bathtub toys. They are fat, slow, and utterly defenseless. His mission is simple: sink the lead freighter. He has done this a dozen times before. It is almost boring. He pushes the stick forward, and the nose of his fighter dips towards the sea. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine of his enemy, the Spitfire, might be a thing of beauty, but his own Daimler-Benz 605 roars with a deeper, more menacing promise of destruction. The air is clear. No enemy fighters in sight. His intelligence briefing was clear. The convoy's anti-aircraft defenses are a joke. A few old Lewis guns. Maybe a Vickers heavy machine gun. Useless against a fast, modern fighter bomber like his. He can already picture the medal, the congratulations from his squadron leader. He lines up the freighter, its rusty deck growing larger in his gun sight. He is a hawk diving on a rabbit. He can see the sailors on the deck scurrying like ants. Fools. He is 1,000 yards out, then 800, then 600. His thumb hovers over the firing button for his 20mm cannons. And then, something impossible happens. The side of the ship erupts in a storm of light. Not the slow, predictable thud-thud-thud of heavy guns he was expecting. This is different. It's a furious, high-speed hammering sound, like a giant woodpecker made of lightning. A wall of incandescent red tracers screams towards him, impossibly fast. He has no time to react. It isn't a stream of bullets. It's a solid buzzsaw of explosive shells. He feels a series of violent, shuddering impacts, like a giant fist punching his aircraft. One moment, his engine is purring with power. The next, it's a mess of shredded metal and black smoke. His canopy shatters, filling the cockpit with a hurricane of wind and the horrifying smell of burning oil. The stick goes limp in his hand. The sky and the sea begin to spin in a sickening blur. Klaus Richter, the god of the skies, is falling. In his last moments of consciousness, a single, baffling question fills his mind. What in God's name just hit me? It wasn't supposed to be there. It was a weapon his superiors had dismissed as a toy, a piece of Swiss clockwork too weak to matter. He was just shot down by a gun that, according to the mighty Luftwaffe, was completely and utterly useless. The story of that devastating surprise attack begins not in the cockpit of a fighter, but in a sterile, quiet office in Berlin, months earlier. Here, the intelligence analysts of the Luftwaffe, the Abwehr, were compiling thick binders of data on British defenses. They were meticulous, thorough, and utterly confident in their assessments. They studied reconnaissance photos, interrogated downed pilots, and analyzed wreckage. Their conclusion about British short-range air defense was clear and dismissive. The primary threat was the Swedish-designed 40mm Bofors gun. It was powerful, accurate, and commanded respect. But it was also heavy, slow to traverse, and couldn't react quickly enough to a low-level, high-speed strafing run. Below the Bofors, the British relied on a hodgepodge of World War I-era machine guns. They were better than nothing, but their small-caliber bullets simply didn't have the stopping power to bring down a modern, all-metal aircraft like a Junkers 88 or a Messerschmitt. And then there was the newcomer, a 20mm cannon they had noted with mild curiosity, the Oerlikon. The files on the Oerlikon were thin. It was a Swiss design, manufactured by a company famous for precision engineering, not heavy ordnance. German experts looked at the specifications and scoffed. The muzzle velocity was significantly lower than their own MGFF cannon. The rate of fire, while respectable, wasn't seen as a game-changer. The shell itself was small. Their own doctrine was built around larger, More powerful guns like the 37 mm and the infamous 88 mm flak cannons. To the German mindset, which valued overwhelming power and engineering supremacy, the Oerlikon looked like a pea shooter. Their official assessment, circulated to Luftwaffe bomber and fighter bomber groups, rated it as a low-level threat, suitable for scaring pilots, but not for inflicting significant damage. They believed a few well-placed armor plates on their aircraft would be more than enough to defeat it. The pilots, confident in their machines and the wisdom of their leaders, took this to heart. They were told to treat the Oerlikon with the same contempt they treated rifle fire from the ground. It was a fatal miscalculation, a blunder of epic proportions born from arrogance and a failure to understand the changing nature of air warfare. They saw the weapon on paper and judged it weak. They failed to imagine what dozens of these weak guns, firing in concert from a pitching ship's deck or a muddy airfield, could actually do. They had analyzed the tool, but they had completely misunderstood how it would be used. And this misunderstanding would soon cost them dearly, sending hundreds of their best pilots and aircraft to fiery graves. The useless gun was about to teach the Luftwaffe a lesson written in fire and blood. The journey of this unlikely giant killer began far from the battlefields of Britain, in the peaceful, neutral mountains of Switzerland. The Oerlikon cannon wasn't a product of a wartime crash program. Its roots went back to the final years of the First World War. It was based on a German design, the Becker 20 mm cannon, which was revolutionary for its time. It used a clever principle called advanced primer ignition blowback, which sounds complicated, but essentially meant it was simpler, lighter, and more reliable than many of its contemporaries. After Germany's defeat, the patents and designs for the Becker cannon ended up with a Swiss firm, CMAG. When CMAG went bankrupt, the Oerlikon Company, based just outside Zurich, acquired all the assets in 1924. For years, Oerlikon's engineers patiently refined the design. They improved the mechanism, developed new types of ammunition, and marketed their creation to nations around the world. It was a purely commercial enterprise. They weren't building a weapon to defend a specific nation. They were building a product to sell on the open market. In the 1930s, as the world began to rearm, business boomed. The Oerlikon was a popular choice for smaller navies and air forces who couldn't afford larger, more complex weapon systems. It was relatively cheap, easy to maintain, and packed a decent punch for its size. Japan became a major customer, as did Italy, and even Romania. Britain and France, however, were initially skeptical. They had their own arms industries and their own ideas about anti-aircraft defense. But a few forward-thinking officers in the Royal Navy, led by Captain Louis Mountbatten, saw its potential. They watched with growing alarm as dive bombers like the German Ju-87 Stuka demonstrated terrifying effectiveness in the Spanish Civil War. The Navy's existing close-in weapon, the 5.0 caliber Vickers machine gun, was proving to be a glorified noisemaker against modern aircraft. They needed something that fired an explosive shell, a weapon that could not just poke holes in a plane, but tear off a wing. In 1937, a British naval delegation visited the Oerlikon factory. They were impressed. The gun was simple, rugged, and its rate of fire of 450 rounds per minute was astounding. A frantic effort began to secure the manufacturing rights. It was a race against time. The clouds of war were gathering over Europe, and the British knew that relying on a Swiss supplier would be impossible once conflict broke out. The negotiations were tense and complex, a chess game of diplomacy and industrial espionage. Finally, a deal was struck. The Royal Navy not only bought a small number of guns directly from Switzerland, but, crucially, secured a license to produce the weapon in the United Kingdom. It was one of the most important administrative decisions of the pre-war era, though few realized it at the time. The blueprints and manufacturing specifications, a treasure trove of Swiss precision engineering, were quietly shipped to Britain. As the first production lines were being set up, the German invasion of Poland began. The clock had run out. Britain was at war, and it was about to discover just how vital that Swiss toy would become. For the Royal Navy in 1939 and 1940, the sky was a place of terror. The sprawling fleets of majestic battleships and cruisers, designed to fight other ships, were suddenly vulnerable from a new direction, directly above. The German Stuka dive bomber was more than just an airplane. It was a psychological weapon. With its terrifying siren, the Jericho trumpet, and its ability to deliver a bomb with pinpoint accuracy, it could break the morale of even the most seasoned sailors. The early months of the war were a brutal education. In the Norwegian campaign and during the evacuation from Dunkirk, British ships were savaged from the air. The traditional anti-aircraft defenses were woefully inadequate. The large, high-angle guns were designed to shoot down high-altitude bombers, not a screaming dive bomber pulling out of its attack a few hundred feet above the waves. The middle layer of defense, the 2-pounder pom-pom gun, was a complex and often unreliable weapon. And at the lowest level, there was the Vickers machine gun. Firing a solid bullet, it could riddle an aircraft with holes. But unless it hit the pilot, or a critical engine component, the plane would often fly away, trailing smoke, but still very much in the fight. What the Navy desperately needed was a last-ditch weapon. A gun that could throw up a dense screen of explosive shells at a moment's notice, one that could be aimed by eye, and that could shred an aircraft in the final, terrifying seconds of its attack run. This was the exact role the Oerlikon was born to fill. The first guns to arrive from Switzerland were rushed into service. They were mounted on simple pedestal mounts, bolted to the decks of destroyers, corvettes, and even armed trawlers. There was no complex fire control, no radar guidance. It was just a gun, a gunner, and a sky full of enemies. The sailors, used to the cumbersome and jam-prone pom-poms, fell in love with the Oerlikon almost immediately. They nicknamed it the Early, or the 20 mil. It was incredibly easy to use. The gunner stood in a shoulder harness, using his own body to swing the barrel and track the target through a simple ring and bead sight. Firing was instinctive. The 60-round drum magazine could be changed in seconds, and the effect on target was spectacular. Unlike machine gun bullets, the Oerlikon's high-explosive shells didn't just punch holes. They ripped them. A short burst could turn an aircraft's aluminum skin into jagged confetti. It could sever control cables, ignite fuel tanks, and shatter engine blocks. The psychological effect was just as important. For the first time, sailors on the deck of a ship felt they could fight back effectively against low-flying aircraft. The roar of the Oerlikon became a sound of defiance, a promise that the ship would not die without a fight. This was the gamble Mountbatten and others had taken. They had chosen a simple, reliable, and available weapon over more complex but unproven solutions. They had bet that a high volume of small explosive shells was the answer to the dive bomber. It was a gamble that would pay off 1,000 times over in the desperate convoy battles of the Atlantic and the Mediterranean. The evacuation of Dunkirk in May and June of 1940 was a watershed moment. While the Royal Navy was learning brutal lessons about air defense at sea, the British Army and the Royal Air Force were learning the same lessons on land. The image of the long, helpless columns of soldiers on the beaches, being mercilessly strafed and bombed by the Luftwaffe, was burned into the national consciousness. It was a stark demonstration of what happens when you lose control of the air. When the battered troops returned to Britain, they brought this lesson with them. The focus then shifted to the defense of Britain itself. The RAF's fighter pilots in their Spitfires and Hurricanes were the heroes of the hour, the few who would defend the island in the air. But what about the airfields they flew from? An airfield is one of the most vulnerable targets imaginable. It's a huge, flat, open space, packed with priceless aircraft, fuel dumps, ammunition stores, and highly trained personnel. During the Battle of Britain, the Luftwaffe made a concerted effort to destroy these airfields, to smash the RAF on the ground. The attacks were relentless. Messerschmitt Bf-110 and Junkers 88 fighter bombers would sweep in at treetop level, their cannons and machine guns blazing, dropping small bombs with devastating accuracy. The existing airfield defenses were, to put it mildly, pathetic. The Army was responsible for providing anti-aircraft cover, but they were stretched thin. Their priority was protecting cities and factories with the heavy guns. The airfields were often left with a handful of Bofors guns, which were too slow for low-level targets, and a few Lewis guns, a design from 1914. The airmen themselves were given rifles and told to shoot at the attacking planes, a gesture of defiance that was utterly futile. The result was carnage. Hangars were turned into twisted, burning skeletons. Aircraft parked in neat rows were systematically destroyed. The cratered runways were a nightmare to repair. More than once, a squadron would return from a grueling dogfight, low on fuel and ammunition, only to find their home base a smoking ruin. It was an unsustainable situation. You could have the best pilots and the best fighters in the world, but if they have no safe place to land, refuel, and rearm, your Air Force will cease to exist. A new solution was needed, and fast. The problem was specific. How do you stop a 50-ton aircraft moving at 300 miles per hour, appearing over the horizon with only seconds of warning? You need a gun that can be brought into action instantly. A gun that fires a shell powerful enough to cause catastrophic damage. And you need a lot of them, scattered all around the airfield's perimeter, creating overlapping fields of fire that an attacker cannot avoid. The Bofors was too slow. The Lewis gun was too weak. The RAF was facing a crisis on the ground that threatened to lose them the war in the air. They needed their own Oerlikon. The crisis facing Britain's airfields led to a radical, and at the time, controversial decision. In February 1942, the Royal Air Force Regiment was officially formed. This was a completely new type of military unit. For the first time, the RAF would have its own dedicated army, soldiers whose sole purpose was to seize, secure, and defend airfields. It was a direct response to the disasters of 1940, from the chaotic retreats in France to the near destruction of key fighter stations like Biggin Hill and Kenley during the Battle of Britain. The early days of the RAF regiment were a scramble. They were given whatever equipment could be spared. Their initial armament was a motley collection of rifles, Bren guns, and a few ancient armored cars. They trained with a desperate urgency, knowing that the next wave of Luftwaffe attacks was only a matter of time. But from the very beginning, the leadership of the new regiment knew that rifles and machine guns weren't enough. They had studied the problem of airfield defense and come to the same conclusion as the Royal Navy. They needed a rapid-firing cannon. They needed the Oerlikon. The problem was, the Navy had first priority. Every single Oerlikon being built in Britain or arriving from the United States under the Lend-Lease program was earmarked for a ship. The Battle of the Atlantic was raging, and protecting the convoys was seen as the most critical task. The RAF regiment was at the back of the line, forced to make do with scraps. They experimented with other weapons. They mounted machine guns on trucks. They even tried using captured Italian Breda 20mm cannons, which were notoriously unreliable. It was a period of frustrating improvisation. Meanwhile, the threat was evolving. The Luftwaffe's hit-and-run raids were becoming more sophisticated. The new Focke-Wulf 190 fighter bomber was incredibly fast and heavily armed, a true tip-and-run terror. It could scream in below the radar, drop its bombs, and be gone before the Bofors crews could even get their guns aimed. The regiment's gunners watched helplessly as these raiders savaged their airfields, feeling powerless with their inadequate weapons. The pressure on the high command became immense. Air Chief Marshal Sholto Douglas, the head of Fighter Command, argued forcefully that there was no point having a navy if the country's air defenses collapsed. The airfields, he insisted, were the very foundation of Britain's ability to fight the war. Slowly, grudgingly, the priorities began to shift. A small trickle of Oerlikon guns was diverted from naval stores to the RAF regiment. It was a momentous occasion for the fledgling corps. The arrival of the first Oerlikons was met with a mixture of excitement and skepticism. The gunners, who called themselves rock apes, were tough, practical men. They looked at the Swiss cannon, with its distinctive drum magazine and intricate-looking mechanism, and wondered if this Swiss toy was really up to the job. It looked delicate compared to the brutal simplicity of a Bren gun. But as they began to train with it, their doubts evaporated. They discovered what the sailors already knew. The Oerlikon was a beautifully engineered, perfectly balanced, and ferociously effective weapon. The roar of its fire and the sight of its explosive shells striking a target drone filled them with a newfound confidence. They were no longer just ground crew with rifles. They were specialists, airfield defenders armed with a weapon that could finally meet the enemy on equal terms. First impressions matter, especially in wartime. When the Oerlikon cannons began arriving at RAF stations in any significant number, the reception among the ground crews and the men of the new RAF regiment was not one of universal acclaim. To men accustomed to the solid, agricultural simplicity of British-made weapons like the Lee Enfield rifle or the Bren gun, the Oerlikon looked foreign. It was a product of Swiss watchmaking precision, and it seemed almost too well made, too complex for the mud and grit of a frontline airfield. The 60-round drum magazine, perched on top, looked awkward. The mechanism, with its multitude of small, finely machined parts, seemed like a magnet for dirt and a nightmare to maintain in the field. Early training sessions were often frustrating. The gun had a personality, and it demanded to be understood. The drum magazines were heavy and cumbersome to change in a hurry. A failure to seat a new magazine correctly would result in a jam, a catastrophic failure in the heat of an attack. The gun's blowback operating system was powerful, and an inexperienced gunner could easily be thrown off balance by the recoil. The gunners, many of them new recruits who had been civilians just months before, had to learn a whole new set of skills. They weren't just soldiers. They had to become technicians, intimately familiar with every spring, lever, and cog of their new weapon. They learned to strip it down and reassemble it in the dark, to diagnose a stoppage by the sound and feel of the mechanism, and to clear a jam in precious seconds while imaginary Messerschmitts screamed overhead. There was also a degree of professional skepticism. The Army's Bofors gun crews, the undisputed kings of anti-aircraft artillery, tended to look down on the Oerlikon and its operators. The Bofors was a proper artillery piece. It had a crew of 5, a complex predictor for calculating lead, and it fired a massive 40mm shell that could obliterate an aircraft with a single hit. To them, the Oerlikon was a glorified machine gun, a point defense weapon that lacked the range and hitting power of their own guns. They saw the RAF regiment gunners as amateurs, playing at being real soldiers. But what the skeptics failed to appreciate was the Oerlikon's unique strengths. It wasn't designed to engage bombers at 10,000 feet. It was designed for the chaotic, split-second violence of a low-level attack. In that environment, the Bofors was too slow. By the time its crew had identified the target, calculated the firing solution, and swung the heavy barrel around, the Focke-Wulf 190 was already disappearing over the opposite hedgeline, leaving a trail of burning aircraft behind it. The Oerlikon, on the other hand, was lightning fast. A single, skilled gunner could snap it onto a target and be firing in less than 2 seconds. What it lacked in single-shot stopping power, it more than made up for in volume of fire. A battery of 4 Oerlikons could put over 1,800 explosive shells into the sky in a single minute. It was a flying wall of steel that no pilot could ignore. The ground crews and gunners quickly learned this truth on the firing range. As they practiced on towed target drogues, they began to see the magic of the Swiss toy. They learned to walk the stream of tracers onto the target, to lead it instinctively, and they saw the devastating effect of their shells, even on armored targets. The skepticism turned into a quiet, fierce pride. This was their weapon. It might be complicated, it might be demanding, but it was theirs, and they were going to become masters of it. The standard, factory-issue Oerlikon was a fine weapon, but it wasn't perfect for the specific challenges of defending a British airfield. The Swiss had designed it primarily as a naval gun, to be used in broad daylight with good visibility. The British, however, needed a gun that could be used by hastily trained gunners in the gray, misty conditions of an English morning, against targets moving at over 300 miles per hour. This led to a burst of classic British field expedient ingenuity. The most significant problem was the gun sight. The standard Oerlikon came with a cartwheel sight, a complex arrangement of concentric rings designed to help the gunner estimate the lead required to hit a moving target. In theory, it was very precise. In the heat of battle, with a Focke-Wulf screaming towards you at treetop height, it was almost impossible to use. It was too cluttered, too distracting. The gunners needed something simpler, something more instinctive. The solution came from a Royal Navy officer, Captain Mark Pizzey, but it was perfected and popularized by the RAF. It was a beautifully simple device known as the stiff keystick sight, named after the location in Norfolk where it was first tested. It consisted of a simple metal rod with a ring at the far end and a single bead at the gunner's end. That was it. But mounted alongside the barrel, it worked brilliantly. The gunner would look through the ring, place the bead on the enemy aircraft, and fire. For deflection shooting, hitting a target crossing in front of you, they developed a simple rule of thumb. They would imagine a ghost image of the aircraft 1 or 2 lengths ahead of the real one and aim at that. It wasn't scientifically precise, but it was fast, intuitive, and deadly effective. Another key innovation was the mounting. The original naval pedestal mounts were fine for a ship's deck, but on the soft ground of an airfield, they were unstable. The RAF regiment developed their own mounting, the Mark V, a sturdy, triangular frame that could be dug into the ground or bolted onto a concrete slab. It provided a much more stable firing platform, which greatly improved accuracy. They also experimented with mobile platforms. They mounted Oerlikons on the back of trucks, creating gun lorries that could be rapidly moved to reinforce threatened sectors of an airfield. They even developed a specialized armored vehicle, the Crusader AA, which mounted twin Oerlikons in a fully rotating turret. This gave the gun crews protection from bullets and shell splinters and allowed them to engage targets while on the move. But perhaps the most important adaptation was tactical. The regiment didn't just place Oerlikons randomly around an airfield. They developed a sophisticated defense-in-depth doctrine. The guns were dug into well-camouflaged sandbagged pits, often in pairs, at key points around the perimeter. They were positioned to create interlocking fields of fire, covering the most likely avenues of attack. They created flak traps, where an attacking pilot, jinking to avoid one gun position, would fly directly into the sights of another. These gun pits became the gunners' homes. They were Spartan, often damp and cold, but they were the fortresses from which they would fight. They contained the gun, ready to use ammunition in special lockers, and communication lines back to a central command post. The men who manned them knew that they were the airfield's last line of defense. They were no longer just relying on a piece of Swiss technology. They had taken that technology and forged it into a complete weapon system, perfectly adapted to their unique and deadly mission. To truly understand why the Oerlikon became so important, you have to understand the mind of the enemy. By 1942, the Luftwaffe had largely abandoned large-scale daylight bombing raids on Britain. The losses sustained during the Battle of Britain were too high. Instead, they perfected a new and terrifying form of attack: the low-level, high-speed tip-and-run raid, carried out by fighter bombers, or Jabos, as they were known. The undisputed king of the Jabos was the Focke-Wulf 190. This was arguably the best piston-engine fighter of the Second World War. It was fast, heavily armed, incredibly maneuverable, and, thanks to its powerful BMW radial engine, extremely rugged. Unlike the liquid-cooled engines of the Spitfire or the Messerschmitt 109, the FW-190's radial engine could sustain a remarkable amount of damage and keep running. A single machine gun bullet in the cooling system of a Spitfire could be a death sentence. The FW-190 had no such vulnerability. The Jabo pilots were the elite. They were experienced, aggressive, and masters of their craft. Their tactics were brutally simple and effective. They would form up over their bases in France or the Low Countries, often in small groups of 2 or 4 aircraft. They would cross the English Channel at maximum speed, literally skimming the waves, flying so low they were invisible to British radar. Only at the last possible moment would they pop up, climbing just high enough to identify their target: a gasworks, a railway station, or, most prized of all, an RAF airfield. Then they would dive. They came in at angles so shallow they seemed to be part of the landscape, their camouflage making them almost impossible to spot against the backdrop of trees and fields. They would be over the airfield boundary before the air raid sirens had even reached full pitch. For the defenders, it was a nightmare. The total time from the first sighting of a Jabo to the moment it released its bombs could be less than 30 seconds. There was no time for deliberation, no time for complex calculations. It was pure, reactive, instinctive warfare. The Focke-Wulfs would make a single, devastating pass. Their 4 20mm cannons and 2 machine guns would rip into parked aircraft and buildings, while a 500-pound bomb would be released to explode in a hangar or on the main runway. And then, just as quickly as they had appeared, they would be gone, diving back down to treetop level and racing for the safety of the channel, leaving chaos and destruction in their wake. These were not random acts of terror. They were a calculated campaign designed to wear down the RAF, to disrupt its operations, and to force Fighter Command to keep precious squadrons in Britain for defense, rather than sending them overseas. For the defenders on the ground, the Jabo was the ultimate test. It was a fleeting, deadly target. Your entire engagement window might be only 5 or 6 seconds long. If your weapon was too slow to aim, or if it jammed, the opportunity was lost. This was the precise tactical problem that the Oerlikon was uniquely suited to solve. The German pilots, confident in their speed and the element of surprise, believed they were invincible at low level. They had been told the British 20mm guns were a minor nuisance. They were about to discover, in the most violent way possible, how wrong that intelligence was. Imagine a cool, misty morning in the spring of 1943. The location is RAF Kenley, a key fighter station south of London, and a favorite target for the Jabos. For the gunners of the RAF regiment, the day starts like any other. A mug of hot tea, a quick check of the Oerlikon cannons in their sandbagged pits, and then the long, tense wait. The air is still. The only sound is the distant drone of a training aircraft. Suddenly, the tannoy system crackles to life. Bandits 050, 10 miles, low level heading south. That's the only warning they'll get. 10 miles is less than 2 minutes away for a Focke-Wulf. Adrenaline floods the system. In gun pit number 3, Corporal Tom Davies and his number 2, Aircraftman Smith, are already in motion. Davies vaults into the gun's harness, his hands finding the familiar grips. Smith yanks the waterproof cover off the breech and checks the 60-round drum magazine, ensuring it's properly seated. Their eyes scan the northern horizon, trying to pick out a tiny, fast-moving speck against the gray sky. For a few agonizing seconds, there is nothing. Then, they see them. 4 Focke-Wulf 190s, in a loose line abreast, so low their propellers seem to be trimming the tops of the oak trees that mark the airfield's boundary. They are beautiful and terrible, their mottled green and gray camouflage blending perfectly with the English countryside. There is no time to be afraid. Training takes over. Davies swings the heavy barrel of the Oerlikon, the stiff key stick sight coming up. He picks his target, the second aircraft from the left. He doesn't think, he just reacts. His mind makes an instantaneous calculation of speed and angle. He places the aiming bead not on the plane itself, but on a patch of empty sky 2 aircraft lengths in front of it. His thumb squeezes the trigger. The Oerlikon explodes into life. The sound is not a series of distinct bangs, but a single, deafening roar. A canvas-ripping brrrr that vibrates through Davies' entire body. The recoil shoves him back hard against the harness. A torrent of spent brass cartridges clatters onto the floor of the pit. Out of the muzzle, a brilliant stream of red tracer shells rushes to meet the German fighter. For a fraction of a second, it looks like he is missed. The stream of fire seems to be passing harmlessly in front of the Focke-Wulf. But Davies is holding the lead perfectly. The German pilot, fixated on the Spitfires parked by the hangar, flies directly into the wall of explosive shells. The effect is instantaneous and horrific. A series of bright, winking flashes appear all over the aircraft's port wing. It's not like in the movies. There is no big, fiery explosion. Instead, the wing simply disintegrates. Large chunks of twisted metal peel away, and the Focke-Wulf, its aerodynamics utterly destroyed, snaps into a violent, uncontrollable roll. It flicks onto its back and plunges into the ground just beyond the airfield, erupting in a huge, greasy ball of black smoke and orange flame. The entire event, from the first shot to the crash, has taken less than 4 seconds. The other 3 German pilots, seeing their comrade obliterated, break off their attack in panic. They jettison their bombs harmlessly in a field and scatter, racing for home. The ambush is over. Corporal Davies slumps against his gun, the smell of cordite sharp in his nostrils, his ears ringing. He feels a hand on his shoulder. It's Smith, grinning from ear to ear. They have done it. The useless Swiss toy has just proven the German high command fatally wrong. Why did the Oerlikon work so well when German intelligence had dismissed it so thoroughly? The answer lies in a combination of factors, but the most important one was psychological. The Jabo pilots flying the Focke-Wulf 190s were operating in an environment of extreme stress and sensory overload. They were flying at over 300 miles per hour, just feet above the ground. Their attention was focused forward, on identifying their target, lining up their attack run, and avoiding obstacles like trees and church steeples. They were conditioned to expect a certain type of anti-aircraft fire. From the heavy Bofors guns, they expected slow, deliberate shots of large, visible shells that you could, with skill and luck, jink to avoid. From machine guns, they expected streams of small-caliber fire that, while unnerving, were unlikely to cause critical damage to their rugged airframes unless they were exceptionally unlucky. The Oerlikon presented them with something entirely new and terrifying. It existed in the uncanny valley between a machine gun and a cannon. It fired too fast to be a cannon, but its shells were explosive. The first time a pilot encountered a battery of Oerlikons, the experience was profoundly shocking. Instead of 1 or 2 streams of fire, their cockpit canopy would suddenly be filled with a dense, impenetrable web of tracers coming from multiple directions at once. The sheer volume of fire was overwhelming. A single gun fired at 450 rounds per minute. A standard airfield defense post had 2 guns. A well-defended airfield might have 16 or more guns in total, all capable of concentrating their fire on the attacking aircraft. A pilot flying into this maelstrom had no time to think or react. The experience was described by one downed German pilot as flying into a solid wall of light. There was no way to dodge it. If you turned left, you flew into the fire from another gun pit. If you pulled up, you presented a larger target and flew into the optimal range of the Bofors guns waiting for you. The sound of the explosive shells hitting the aircraft was another key psychological factor. A machine gun bullet makes a plink or a thud. An Oerlikon shell, even a non-lethal hit on a non-critical part of the airframe, exploded with a loud, violent bang. A short burst could sound like a string of firecrackers going off right next to the pilot's ear, causing panic and disorientation. This element of surprise was the Oerlikon's greatest weapon in the early days. The pilots had been briefed that these guns were not a major threat. Their first encounter was a brutal refutation of that briefing. This created a crisis of confidence. Pilots began to distrust their intelligence reports. They became hesitant, flak-shy. An attacker who is hesitant is an attacker who is more likely to miss their target or to break off their attack prematurely. The Oerlikon didn't just shoot down airplanes. It broke the morale of the men who flew them. It turned the last few seconds of their attack run, which should have been a moment of focused aggression, into a terrifying gamble for their own survival. The gun that Berlin had dismissed as a toy had become a monster in the minds of the Luftwaffe's finest pilots. While the psychological shock was potent, it was backed up by brutal technological efficiency. The German analysts who dismissed the Oerlikon based on its raw specifications made a classic mistake. They failed to see how those specifications would translate into real-world combat effectiveness. They focused on its relatively low muzzle velocity compared to their own cannons, seeing it as a weakness. But for a short-range weapon, extreme muzzle velocity wasn't the most important factor. What mattered was rate of fire, shell type, and reliability. And in these areas, the Oerlikon was a world beater. Its rate of fire, around 450 rounds per minute, was the sweet spot. It was fast enough to create a dense stream of projectiles, making it much easier for the gunner to walk the fire onto a fast-moving target. At the same time, it was slow enough to be controllable and not burn through its 60-round magazine in a mere handful of seconds. This gave the gunner precious time to correct their aim during a burst. But the real genius of the system was the shell itself. The 20 by 110 millimeter shell was a masterpiece of miniature destruction. Unlike a solid machine gun bullet that relies on kinetic energy alone, the Oerlikon shell carried its own payload. The standard high-explosive HE round was filled with a small but powerful charge. When it struck the thin aluminum skin of an aircraft, it didn't just punch a hole. It blasted a hole the size of a man's fist. A single hit could sever a critical control cable, puncture a hydraulic line, or shatter a cockpit instrument panel. Multiple hits could, quite literally, saw a wing off. The British and Americans also developed high-explosive incendiary HEI rounds. These had a similar explosive charge, but also contained an incendiary mixture that would ignite on impact, with a high chance of starting a catastrophic fuel or oil fire. This was the true terror for pilots. Getting shot down was one thing. Burning to death was another. The Germans had underestimated the destructive power of these small shells. They assumed the light armor around the cockpit and engine of their Focke-Wulf 190s would be sufficient. But the Oerlikon didn't need to penetrate the armor. It just needed to hit the aircraft anywhere. A burst across the tail would shred the rudder and elevators, rendering the plane uncontrollable. A burst into the wing root could ignite the fuel tanks stored there. A hit on the propeller could unbalance it, causing such violent vibrations that the engine would tear itself from its mountings. The gun's simple, robust blowback mechanism also made it incredibly reliable, far more so than some of the more complex gas-operated cannons of the era. In the dirt, rain, and mud of a British airfield, this was a life-saving virtue. The gunners knew that when they squeezed the trigger, their Oerlikon would fire. This combination of a high rate of fire, a devastating explosive shell, and rock-solid reliability was what made the Oerlikon so deadly. It was the perfect synthesis of technology, a weapon that delivered exactly the right kind of punishment, at exactly the right time, to defeat a specific and deadly threat. The German engineers had the data, but the British gunners had the results. History is not just about machines and tactics. It's about the people who lived through it. For every official report detailing aircraft shot down, there are 100 untold stories of the men who pulled the triggers. The gunners of the RAF regiment were a unique breed. They weren't pilots, the glamorous heroes of the air, nor were they infantrymen in the traditional sense. They were defenders, guardians of the gate, and their lives were a strange mixture of long periods of intense boredom, punctuated by moments of sheer, heart-stopping terror. A typical Oerlikon gun pit was a small, semi-subterranean world. It was a hole in the ground, lined with sandbags and corrugated iron, with a concrete hardstanding for the gun itself. It was cramped, often wet, and smelled perpetually of damp earth, gun oil, and stale tea. This was home for the two-man gun crew during their shift. For hours on end, nothing would happen. They would clean the gun, meticulously checking every part. They would clean it again. They would practice loading drills until they could swap a 60-round magazine in the dark in under 5 seconds. They would talk, smoke, read, and stare at the empty sky, their nerves stretched taut. They became experts in aircraft recognition, able to distinguish the silhouette of a friendly Spitfire from an enemy Focke-Wulf at miles of distance. They learned the unique sounds of different aero engines, a skill that could give them a few precious extra seconds of warning. One famous story from RAF Hornchurch tells of a gun crew who had adopted a stray dog. The dog, nicknamed Bandit, had an uncanny ability to hear the high-pitched whine of the Focke-Wulf's engines long before any human could. His barking became their primary air raid warning, and he was credited with saving the lives of several pilots who were caught on the ground. There was a fierce, competitive pride between the different gun crews. They kept unofficial scoreboards, marking each confirmed kill with a painted swastika on the side of their gun shield. A successful crew became local heroes, earning extra rations and the admiration of the pilots whose lives they protected. A strong bond often formed between the gunners and the pilots. They shared the same space, faced the same enemy, and understood the stakes. Pilots would often visit the gun pits after a mission, sharing a cigarette and thanking the rock apes for keeping the runways safe. They knew that their lives depended as much on the vigilance of the men on the ground as on their own skill in the air. But there was also tragedy. These gun pits were prime targets. Attacking pilots would often try to suppress the anti-aircraft fire before making their main bombing run. A strafing run from a Focke-Wulf's cannons could be devastating for the exposed gun crews, or a bomb, aimed for the runway, could fall short. Many gunners died at their posts, fighting to the very last second. These personal stories of the boredom, the camaraderie, the sudden violence, and the quiet courage are the true story of the Oerlikon. The gun was a brilliant piece of engineering, but it was the ordinary men, the former clerks, farmhands, and shopkeepers who manned them, that turned it into a legend. They were the human element in the machine of war, the last line of defense for the few. The success of the Oerlikon created a new problem: demand. Suddenly, everyone wanted one. The Royal Navy wanted to equip every vessel in the fleet, from battleships to fishing trawlers. The RAF regiment needed thousands to defend the growing number of airfields across Britain and later overseas. The Army wanted them for protecting ports, supply dumps, and command centers. The original British production lines, established just before the war, were working around the clock, but they couldn't possibly keep up. The initial manufacturing process was slow and painstaking. It was based on the original Swiss blueprints and required highly skilled machinists and a great deal of precision engineering. It was fine for a peacetime factory in Zurich, but it was not suited for the desperate realities of total war. Britain needed to mass-produce the Oerlikon, and it needed to do it yesterday. The challenge fell to the Ministry of Supply, and they tackled it with a combination of industrial might and clever simplification. The entire manufacturing process was overhauled. Tolerances were relaxed on non-critical parts. Complex machine components were replaced with simpler, more rugged stamped or cast parts where possible. New production techniques, many learned from the automotive industry, were introduced to speed up assembly. The number of man-hours required to produce a single gun began to fall dramatically. But even this was not enough. The decisive contribution came from across the Atlantic. The United States, even before officially entering the war, recognized the Oerlikon's value through the Lend-Lease program. The U.S. Navy was facing the same threat from air attack in the Pacific and had also adopted the Oerlikon as its primary light anti-aircraft weapon. American industrial power was unleashed on the problem. Companies that had once made cars, refrigerators, and sewing machines were retooled to produce Oerlikon cannons and their ammunition. The scale of American production was staggering. The Packard Motor Car Company, for example, set up a huge production line that churned out tens of thousands of guns. The Pontiac division of General Motors became another major producer. By 1943, the United States was producing Oerlikons at a rate that dwarfed British efforts. These American-made guns began to flow into Britain in a steady stream, equipping new RAF regiment squadrons and freeing up British production for other urgent needs. The ammunition supply, once a critical bottleneck, became a flood. Millions upon millions of 20mm shells were produced in American factories, ensuring that the gunners on the front line would never have to worry about running out of bullets in the middle of a fight. This transatlantic industrial partnership was the hidden story behind the Oerlikon's success. The gun may have been a Swiss design, perfected by British tactics, but it was American mass production that put it into the hands of enough soldiers and sailors to truly change the course of the war in the skies. It was a victory not just of courage and technology, but of logistics and manufacturing on an epic scale. The little gun that could had the might of the world's greatest industrial power standing behind it. So, how effective was the Oerlikon really? Anecdotes and pilot testimonials are powerful, but the cold, hard numbers tell an even more compelling story. Compiling exact statistics for battlefield effectiveness is always difficult. The fog of war is a real phenomenon. In the chaos of an air raid, with multiple guns firing at the same aircraft, it was often impossible to know for sure which gun fired the fatal shot. A Bofors crew might claim a kill that was also claimed by a nearby Oerlikon crew. However, by carefully analyzing combat reports, gun camera footage, and wreckage, military analysts were able to build a remarkably clear picture of the Oerlikon's contribution. The Royal Navy's statistics were the most clear-cut. By the middle of the war, they estimated that Oerlikons were responsible for around 32% of all German aircraft shot down by ship-based anti-aircraft fire. This is a staggering number for a weapon that was considered the lightest in the naval arsenal. It consistently outperformed the heavier and far more complex multi-barreled pom-pom cannons. The U.S. Navy's figures were even more dramatic. In the Pacific Theater, against Japanese aircraft, the Oerlikon was the undisputed champion of close-in air defense. For the period up to mid-1944, the U.S. Navy credited the 20mm Oerlikon with 48.5% of all Japanese planes destroyed by its anti-aircraft fire. It was, by a huge margin, the most effective anti-aircraft weapon in the entire American fleet. On land, with the RAF regiment, the numbers were harder to isolate but no less impressive. At the height of the tip-and-run raids in 1942 and 1943, the number of successful Jabo attacks on airfields plummeted. While the presence of Spitfire patrols was a major factor, the flak traps of Oerlikons and Bofors guns were the decisive element that made these low-level raids prohibitively costly for the Luftwaffe. Official RAF analyses credited the Oerlikon with a significant portion of the 154 enemy aircraft shot down by the RAF regiment over its airfields during the war. One report analyzing the defense of Malta, the most bombed place on Earth during the war, showed the Oerlikon's incredible cost-effectiveness. The study calculated the number of rounds that had to be fired, on average, to shoot down one enemy aircraft. For the heavy 3.7-inch guns, the number was in the thousands. For the Bofors, it was well over 1,000. For the 20mm Oerlikon, the number was just a few hundred. It was punching far, far above its weight. These statistics confirmed what the gunners on the ground and the sailors at sea already knew in their bones. The Oerlikon worked. It worked better than anyone, apart from a few far-sighted officers, had ever dared to hope. The German intelligence assessment, which had dismissed it as a nuisance, was proven to be one of the great analytical blunders of the war. They had looked at the gun in isolation. They had failed to account for the tactics, the mass numbers, and the sheer determination of the men who operated it. The numbers didn't lie. The pea shooter had become a giant killer. The Luftwaffe was not stupid. They were professional, highly skilled, and adaptable. When their pilots started returning to base, or failing to return, with shocking stories of impenetrable walls of fire over English airfields, the high command paid attention. The initial reaction was disbelief. The reports were dismissed as pilot exaggeration, an excuse for failed missions. But as the losses mounted, and as wreckage analysis showed aircraft shredded by 20mm explosive shells, the truth became undeniable. The useless Oerlikon was a serious threat. Acknowledging the problem was the first step. Solving it was much harder. The German tactical response evolved over several stages. First, they tried brute force. They instructed their pilots to specifically target and suppress the Oerlikon positions during their attack runs. A Focke-Wulf pilot would try to strafe a gun pit with his own powerful cannons before releasing his bomb. This was a deadly game of chicken. The gun crews were exposed, but they were also firing back. For every gun pit that was silenced, another would open up on the attacking aircraft. This tactic led to increased losses on both sides, but did not solve the fundamental problem for the Luftwaffe. Next, they changed their attack profiles. The original tip-and-run tactic involved a very low, straight-in approach. This gave the Oerlikon gunners a relatively stable, predictable target. The new tactic involved a pop-up attack from a higher altitude. The Jabos would approach the coast at low level, then climb rapidly to a few thousand feet before diving steeply onto the target. This made them a much harder target for the Oerlikons. The dive angle was too steep, and the speed was too high. However, this tactic had its own major drawback. By climbing to a higher altitude, the Jabos became clearly visible on British radar. This gave the defending RAF Spitfire patrols crucial minutes of warning to intercept them. What had been a surprise raid now became a running dogfight. Luftwaffe losses to fighters began to climb again. They also experiment with different approach routes, attacking from the direction of the sun to blind the gunners, or using cloud cover to mask their approach. They increased the armor plating on their aircraft, particularly around the engine and cockpit. But the sheer volume of Oerlikon fire often rendered these measures moot. An explosive shell didn't need to penetrate the cockpit. It just needed to blow off a rudder or an aileron to make the plane uncontrollable. Ultimately, the most significant German reaction was avoidance. By late 1943, daylight, low-level armed reconnaissance missions over southern England were classified as exceptionally hazardous. Airfields defended by the RAF regiment and its Oerlikons were marked on Luftwaffe maps as flak alleys, places to be avoided at all costs. The Jabos shifted their focus to less well-defended targets, like coastal shipping or railway lines. This, in itself, was a major strategic victory for the British. The primary goal of airfield defense was not just to shoot down planes, but to allow the RAF to operate without disruption. By making attacks on its bases too costly, the Oerlikon had effectively created a protective shield around Fighter Command's most vital assets. The hunters had become the hunted, and the toy gun was now the master of its domain. As the Oerlikon proved its worth in defending airfields, military planners began to realize its potential in a wider variety of roles. The gun was too good to be confined to static defense positions. Its combination of lightweight, rapid fire, and destructive power made it an incredibly versatile weapon. The British Army, initially slow to adopt the cannon, began to see its value for protecting vulnerable points beyond the airfields. Oerlikons started appearing in the defense of crucial ports like Dover and Southampton, guarding against low-level attacks aimed at shipping and dock facilities. They were used to protect vital command centers, supply dumps, and radar stations. Anywhere a low-level attack was a significant threat, the Oerlikon became the weapon of choice. One of the most innovative applications was the creation of mobile anti-aircraft units. The Army and the RAF regiment mounted Oerlikons on the back of 3-ton Bedford trucks. These gun lorries were not heavily armored, but they were highly mobile. They could be rushed to any threatened area, set up in minutes, and provide a nasty surprise for attacking aircraft. They were used to protect temporary forward landing strips built in the wake of the D-Day landings, and to provide cover for advancing Army columns. The pinnacle of mobile Oerlikon development was the Crusader AA tank. The chassis of the outdated Crusader cruiser tank was fitted with a specially designed, lightly armored, open-top turret containing 2 Oerlikon cannons. The Crusader AA Mark II and III were fast, maneuverable, and could keep up with the main armored formations. Their job was to protect the tank columns from the constant threat of Luftwaffe fighter bombers. With a combined rate of fire of 900 rounds per minute, a Crusader AA could throw up a terrifying curtain of fire, forcing enemy pilots to break off their attacks or risk being shredded. The gun also found a home in coastal defense. Mounted in concrete emplacements along the cliffs of southern England, Oerlikons were used to engage German E-boats, fast torpedo boats that preyed on British coastal shipping at night. The gun's high rate of fire and incendiary shells were devastatingly effective against the wooden-hulled, gasoline-powered E-boats. This expansion of roles demonstrated the fundamental excellence of the Oerlikon's design. It was a weapon system that was not tied to a single purpose. It was adaptable, a jack-of-all-trades that could be a ship's last line of defense, a guardian for a vital airfield, a mobile bodyguard for a tank column, or a coastal sentry. It was the Swiss Army knife of anti-aircraft guns. This versatility ensured that even as newer, more powerful weapons began to appear, the Oerlikon remained in high demand across every branch of the armed forces, a testament to its simple, rugged, and deadly effectiveness. The story of the Oerlikon is not solely a British one. While the British were the first to truly recognize its potential and use it to devastating effect in Europe, the United States Navy would become the gun's single largest user, deploying it on a scale that dwarfed even the Royal Navy. In the days leading up to America's entry into the war, U.S. naval observers in Britain watched the performance of the Oerlikon with intense interest. They saw how effective it was against the Luftwaffe and recognized that their own fleet had a critical vulnerability. The standard American close-in anti-aircraft weapon was the 50 caliber Browning machine gun. It was a fine weapon, but like the British Vickers, it fired a solid projectile that lacked the knockdown power to stop a determined dive bomber or torpedo plane. The devastating attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, was a brutal confirmation of this weakness. The images of American battleships, helpless under the onslaught of Japanese aircraft, galvanized the U.S. Navy into action. A massive, top-priority program was initiated to equip the fleet with 20mm Oerlikon cannons. The American industrial machine, once fully engaged, performed miracles of production. The Oerlikon, with its complex Swiss design, was completely re-engineered for American mass production methods. The number of man-hours to build one gun was slashed from over 400 to less than 80. Factories that had been making civilian goods were converted, and by the end of the war, American industry had produced a staggering 125,000 Oerlikon cannons. They were mounted on every type of vessel, from mighty Iowa-class battleships and Essex-class aircraft carriers, down to small submarine chasers and landing craft. A typical destroyer might have half a dozen Oerlikons, while a carrier could have 40 or more. In the vast expanses of the Pacific, the nature of the threat was different, but just as deadly. The Japanese Navy and Army Air Forces were masters of coordinated air attacks. They would come in waves, with dive bombers, torpedo planes, and fighters, all trying to overwhelm a ship's defenses. The ultimate expression of this was the kamikaze, the divine wind, where pilots would deliberately crash their bomb-laden aircraft into Allied ships. In these terrifying last-ditch encounters, the Oerlikon was often the only thing standing between a ship and its destruction. The American sailors, like their British counterparts, loved the gun. It was reliable, easy to aim, and its stream of explosive shells gave them a tangible way to fight back against the terrifying kamikazes. Gun crews would stay at their posts amidst a hail of fire, pouring a continuous stream of 20mm shells into a diving Japanese plane, hoping to detonate its bomb or destroy it before it could reach the deck. Countless ships and thousands of lives were saved by the courage of these gunners and the effectiveness of their Oerlikons. The American experience was a parallel validation of the British gamble. It proved that in the face of modern air power, a simple, reliable, rapid-firing cannon was one of the most effective life insurance policies a navy could have. The gun that was born in neutral Switzerland and blooded in the English Channel would go on to fight and win battles across the globe, from the frigid waters of the North Atlantic to the warm coral seas of the Pacific. To truly grasp the reality of the Oerlikon's role, let's spend a day with a gun crew. The date is June 5, 1944. The place is a forward airstrip in southern England, packed with the Spitfires and Typhoons that will provide air cover for the D-Day landings, scheduled to begin in just a few hours. The atmosphere is electric with anticipation and tension. For the crew of Gun Emplacement Charlie 2, Corporal Jones and Aircraftman Peterson, the day begins before dawn, at 0400 hours. The stand-to order is given. In the cold, pre-dawn gloom, they man their Oerlikon. They run through their checks by touch alone. They wipe down the breech, check the tension on the springs, and spin the gun on its mount to ensure it traverses smoothly. Peterson hefts a 60-round drum magazine, feeling its familiar weight, and locks it into place on top of the gun with a solid, reassuring clunk. The dawn comes slowly, revealing a sky thick with cloud. It's a mixed blessing. The cloud cover will make it harder for the Luftwaffe to find them, but it will also make it harder for them to spot any attackers that do get through. The morning hours drag on. They drink lukewarm tea from a flask and eat hard biscuits. They listen to the constant roar of aircraft engines as flight after flight of Allied planes takes off, heading for France. They feel like the gatekeepers of history, watching the greatest invasion fleet ever assembled pass over their heads. They talk in low tones, not about the invasion, but about trivial things. The girl Peterson met at a dance, a letter from Jones's wife. It's a way to keep the fear at bay. Around noon, the tension breaks. A single, high-pitched engine sound cuts through the drone of the friendly aircraft. It's a sound they know instantly and instinctively. Jones shouts, "Jabo!" before he even sees it. A lone Messerschmitt Bf 109, on a desperate reconnaissance mission, breaks through the clouds. It's moving incredibly fast, heading straight for the runway. Jones is already in the harness, swinging the Oerlikon. Peterson is braced, ready with a fresh magazine. The 109 is a fleeting target, a gray blur against a gray sky. Jones gets the stiff key stick sight onto the fighter's path, gives it a touch of lead, and fires. A 3-second burst. Brrrrap! The tracers seem to fly straight and true. But the German pilot is good. He sees the fire, rolls his aircraft violently, and the shells pass just behind his tail. The Messerschmitt disappears back into the clouds as quickly as it came. A miss. A frustrating, heart-pounding miss. The adrenaline fades, leaving a sour taste in their mouths. The rest of the afternoon is quiet. The waiting game resumes. As dusk falls, the tension returns. This is another dangerous time. In the fading light, an attacker is hardest to spot. They strain their eyes, watching the shadows lengthen. But nothing comes. The sky darkens, and the order comes to stand down. They cover the gun for the night, clean their equipment, and head back to their barracks for a few hours of fitful sleep. They didn't shoot down an enemy plane today. They didn't become heroes. But they did their job. They were there, they were ready. And their presence was part of the shield that protected this vital airfield on this most crucial of days. For thousands of gunners, this was the reality of their war. 99% boredom and 1% pure terror. The runaway success of the Oerlikon created an insatiable demand that even British and American mass production struggled to meet. The gun was so effective that military planners wanted to put it on everything that floated or moved. This immense pressure, combined with a constant need to simplify production and reduce reliance on imported machine tools, led to the development of a remarkable homegrown alternative, the Polsten gun. The story of the Polsten is a fascinating tale of wartime ingenuity and international cooperation. The design originated in Poland before the war, as a simplified version of the Oerlikon. When Poland was overrun in 1939, the Polish design team managed to escape to Great Britain, bringing the precious blueprints with them. They were put in touch with British engineers from the Sten gun project, who were masters of designing weapons for cheap and rapid manufacture. The goal was to create a people's cannon, a gun that retained the firepower and reliability of the Oerlikon, but could be built in smaller workshops with less sophisticated equipment. The result of this collaboration was the Polsten 20mm cannon. At first glance, it looked very similar to an Oerlikon. It fired the same ammunition and had a similar rate of fire, but under the hood, it was a radically different beast. The Oerlikon was a masterpiece of complex, interlocking, machined parts. It had 250 of them. The Polsten was a work of brutalist simplification. It had only 119 parts. Where the Oerlikon used a complex drum magazine that was slow and awkward to reload, the Polsten used a simple vertical box magazine that held 30 rounds. It could be reloaded in a fraction of the time. The entire weapon was designed from the ground up to be made from stamped steel and welded components, eliminating many of the time-consuming milling and lathing operations required for the Oerlikon. The result was a gun that was significantly cheaper and faster to produce. It entered mass production in Britain and Canada in 1944. It was never intended to completely replace the Oerlikon, which was still considered the superior weapon, especially in naval applications, where its smooth action and drum magazine were advantageous. Instead, the Polsten was designed to supplement it. It was widely used by the Army and the RAF regiment. It was mounted on trucks, trailers, and in static positions. It was also the weapon of choice for the Crusader AA tank and other mobile platforms. For the gunners, the Polsten was a good, solid weapon. It lacked some of the refined feel of the Swiss original, and its box magazine meant more frequent reloads. But it was reliable, accurate, and it did the job. The existence of the Polsten is a testament to the pragmatism of the Allied war effort. They recognize that the best is often the enemy of the good enough. While the Oerlikon was the perfect solution, the Polsten was the practical one. It allowed them to get thousands of effective anti-aircraft cannons into the field quickly and cheaply, ensuring that even as the war reached its climax, the soldiers on the ground never lacked the tools they needed to defend themselves from the sky. Every weapon has its moment of glory, a period when it is perfectly matched to the threats of the battlefield. For the Oerlikon, that period was from 1941 to early 1944. It was the undisputed master of low-level air defense. But warfare is a relentless engine of progress. Aircraft technology was advancing at a breathtaking pace. The new jets, like the Messerschmitt 262, were entering service. Even the latest piston-engine fighters were flying faster, were more heavily armored, and were built to withstand more punishment than the aircraft of the early war years. By mid-1944, the 20mm shell of the Oerlikon was starting to look a little small. It could still be devastatingly effective, but it now took more hits to guarantee a kill on a tougher, faster aircraft. The engagement windows were shrinking. A Focke-Wulf 190 was a difficult target. A Me-262, streaking across the sky at over 500 miles per hour, was an almost impossible one. The military planners saw this coming. The search was already on for the Oerlikon's successor. The logical step was to move up in caliber. The Allies had the excellent 40mm Bofors gun, and they began to develop new versions with greatly improved fire control systems. The Bofors had always had the range and hitting power that the Oerlikon lacked. Its main drawback was its slow rate of fire and traverse speed. New power-assisted mounts and radar-guided predictors began to solve these problems, turning the Bofors into a much more responsive and lethal weapon, capable of dealing with the faster targets of the late war. The British also experimented with other calibers. They developed a 37mm cannon, but it never saw widespread service. The Americans began to mount multiple .50 caliber machine guns together in powered turrets, relying on an immense volume of fire to shred targets. This doesn't mean the Oerlikon became obsolete overnight. It continued to be a vital part of the Allied anti-aircraft network, right up to the end of the war. It was still highly effective against slower aircraft and was present in huge numbers. During the D-Day landings, every landing craft, every transport ship, was bristling with Oerlikons, providing a crucial shield against the Luftwaffe's desperate attacks on the beachhead. It continued to serve with distinction in the Pacific, where the threat from kamikaze attacks remained severe until the final day of the war. But its peak had passed. The era of the simple, visually aimed light automatic cannon as the primary air defense weapon was drawing to a close. The future belonged to heavier, radar-guided guns and, eventually, to the guided missile. The decline of the Oerlikon was not a story of failure, but a natural consequence of the brutal, fast-paced evolution of military technology. It had been the perfect weapon for its time, a tool that had perfectly answered one of the most pressing tactical questions of the war. It had saved countless lives and played a crucial role in securing Allied victory. But now, the nature of the question was changing. The Dieppe raid on August 19, 1942, was a bloody and controversial chapter in the Second World War. A large force, primarily composed of Canadian troops, launched a frontal assault on the German-held French port of Dieppe. The raid was, from a military standpoint, a catastrophic failure with immense casualties. However, it was also a crucible, a brutal testing ground for weapons and tactics. And for the Oerlikon cannon, it was one of its most intense and revealing trials. The planners of the raid were acutely aware of the threat from the Luftwaffe. The invasion fleet would be operating just a few miles off the French coast, well within range of numerous German fighter and bomber bases. Providing air cover would be the job of the RAF, but the ships themselves would need to be their own floating anti-aircraft fortresses. As a result, the Dieppe flotilla was packed with an unprecedented concentration of Oerlikon guns. Every vessel, from the destroyers providing naval gunfire support down to the small landing craft that would carry the infantry ashore, was armed with them. The new landing craft flak, LCF vessels, were essentially floating Oerlikon platforms, each carrying multiple cannons. The theory was that this massive volume of fire would create a protective flak umbrella over the landing beaches. As the fleet approached the coast in the pre-dawn darkness, the theory was put to the test. The Luftwaffe responded with speed and ferocity. Waves of Dornier bombers and Focke-Wulf fighter bombers swarmed over the ships. The sky erupted in a storm of tracer fire. The combined roar of hundreds of Oerlikons was said to be deafening, a continuous, hellish noise that drowned out everything else. In this chaotic environment, the Oerlikon performed with mixed results. On the one hand, it proved to be a formidable deterrent. The sheer density of fire forced many German pilots to bomb from higher altitudes, drastically reducing their accuracy. Numerous German aircraft were shot down or driven off by the hail of 20mm shells. The gunners, many of them in their first taste of combat, fought with incredible bravery, staying at their exposed posts, even as their small craft were being torn apart by enemy fire. On the other hand, the raid highlighted some of the Oerlikon's limitations. The smoke and chaos of battle made visual aiming extremely difficult. Gunners struggled to distinguish friend from foe in the swirling dogfights overhead. And while the Oerlikon was deadly against a low-flying Focke-Wulf, it was far less effective against bombers dropping their payloads from 8 or 10,000 feet. It simply didn't have the range. Despite the horrific losses on the ground, the naval anti-aircraft defense, with the Oerlikon at its core, was considered one of the partial successes of the raid. The fleet was able to remain off the coast for hours under constant air attack and evacuate the survivors without being annihilated. The lessons learned at Dieppe were paid for in blood, but they were invaluable. They led to the development of better fire control tactics, improved communication between ships and fighter cover, and reinforced the need for a layered air defense combining the short-range punch of the Oerlikon with the high-altitude reach of heavier guns. Dieppe was a tragedy, but for the story of the Oerlikon, it was a baptism of fire that proved its worth in the crucible of one of the war's most intense amphibious operations. The end of the Second World War in 1945 did not mean the end of the Oerlikon. Unlike many weapons that were quickly scrapped or put into storage, the little Swiss cannon had proven itself so versatile, reliable, and cost-effective that it continued to serve in armies and navies around the world for decades. Its legacy is a powerful testament to the quality of its original design. In the immediate post-war years, the Oerlikon remained the standard light anti-aircraft gun for the Royal Navy, the U.S. Navy, and dozens of other maritime forces. The threat of jet aircraft was on the horizon, but for defending against propeller-driven planes and for use against surface targets, it was still an excellent weapon. It saw active service in the Korean War, where it was used on ships for air defense and mounted on trucks and half-tracks for ground support, providing valuable firepower against infantry and light vehicles. The gun's basic mechanism was so sound that it became the foundation for a new generation of aircraft cannons. The British, for example, developed the famous Aden cannon, and the French developed the Difa cannon. Both of these highly successful post-war aircraft guns used a revolver mechanism, but their fundamental principles of reliability and firepower owed a debt to the pioneering work done on cannons like the Oerlikon. The gun itself was continually updated and modified. New types of ammunition were developed, with higher velocities and more effective warheads. New mounting systems were designed, often incorporating simple fire control systems or linking multiple guns together for increased firepower. Even as guided missile systems began to take over the primary air defense role in the 1960s and 70s, the Oerlikon found a new lease on life. It was recognized as an effective weapon for defending against sea-skimming anti-ship missiles. The theory was that a missile, like a low-flying aircraft, could be destroyed by a dense cloud of explosive shells. This led to the development of close-in weapon systems, CIWS, like the Phalanx, which, while using a more advanced Gatling gun design, operate on the same principle as the World War II Oerlikon. Stop the threat at the last possible second with an overwhelming volume of fire. Today, direct descendants of the Oerlikon are still in service. The company, now part of Rheinmetall, continues to produce advanced 35mm and 30mm cannons that are among the best in the world. These modern weapon systems, mounted on ships and armored vehicles, can trace their lineage directly back to that original Becker design from World War I. The Oerlikon's true legacy, however, is not just in the hardware it inspired. It's in the tactical lesson it taught, that sometimes the most effective solution is not the biggest or the most powerful weapon, but the one that is simple, reliable, and available in sufficient numbers. It's a lesson in the danger of underestimation, a reminder that genius in warfare often lies in seeing the hidden potential in a tool that others have dismissed. The useless gun became a legend, and its story remains a classic example of how the right weapon, in the right hands, at the right time, can change history. So we return to where we began, the paradox of the weapon that should have been useless. The story of the Oerlikon cannon is more than just the history of a piece of military hardware. It is a human story. It's a story of Swiss engineers whose dedication to precision created a masterpiece. It's a story of insightful British naval officers who saw its potential when others were blind. It's a story of American industrial might that turned a boutique weapon into a tool of global warfare. But most of all, it's the story of the thousands of ordinary sailors, soldiers, and airmen who stood behind that gun, in the freezing spray of the Atlantic, or the choking dust of a desert airfield, and faced down the enemy. They were the ones who turned a toy into a terror. The German High Command's initial assessment was not entirely wrong on paper. The Oerlikon did have a lower muzzle velocity than its German counterparts. It did fire a smaller shell than the mighty Bofors. By the cold logic of engineering specifications, it should have been a secondary weapon, a minor player on the stage of war. Their mistake was a failure of imagination. They could not imagine the tactical innovation of the flak trap, the psychological shock of a dozen guns opening fire at once, or the sheer, stubborn courage of a gun crew determined to defend their ship or their airfield to the last round. They failed to understand that in the split-second reality of a low-level attack, the fastest gun wins, not necessarily the biggest. The Oerlikon became a war winner not because of any single, overwhelming feature, but because of a perfect balance of qualities. It was reliable. It was fast. It was powerful enough. It was simple enough to be used by citizen soldiers. And it was available in vast, war-winning numbers. It stands as a timeless lesson in military history. Never underestimate your opponent, and never, ever judge a weapon by its specifications alone. The true measure of a gun is not found on a blueprint or in a testing report. It is found in the heat of battle, in the hands of the people who use it. And by that measure, the useless Swiss cannon that shot down hundreds of the Luftwaffe's finest, was one of the greatest weapons of the Second World War.